So a couple of lectures ago, we looked at glass and we talked about the British ferro-vitreous tradition leading up to the Crystal Palace, and talked about what a groundbreaking structure that was. And today I want to look at a set of American ferro-vitreous buildings, or we'll get to ferro-vitreous buildings. They start off as more hybrids that live up to some of the promises of the Crystal Palace. And to do that, I want to take off basically from Viollet-le-Duc's suggestion of the iron-framed skyscraper, not a term that he uses or that would have been in use when he was writing, but a term that of course comes into great use late in the 19th century, early in the 20th. And the combination of iron's strength with glass's lightweight and transparency is not only good for exposition buildings, but it's also good, as we'll see, for multi-story structures. When we talk about American skyscrapers and Chicago skyscrapers in particular, we often think of Louis Sullivan's famous aphorism, right? Form follows function. And the skyscraper to him was an example of this, that the function of a skyscraper was to go tall, and therefore the form of the building, the ornament, everything that went into it had to make it look tall, had to emphasize that. And this has been sort of misinterpreted as a sort of functionalist dictum, that the only choice architects have is to sort of follow exactly the function of a building, and that will determine for you what your form is. That wasn't even true back in the 1890s, and in fact Louis Sullivan's business partner, engineer Dankmar Adler, corrected him after Sullivan published this famous article in 1896. Adler, in a lecture, noted that to him, form didn't necessarily follow function directly, and in fact one of the things that changed the form of a building had to do with materials. And Adler pointed out to Sullivan that, as we'll see, throughout their career together in the previous 20 years, they had designed many skyscrapers. The function had stayed exactly the same. Stack as many lettable floors as you can on top of one another safely. But the forms had changed radically, and that had been more due to the material changes than anything else. So the skyscraper is a product of real estate speculation. Cass Gilbert, the Minneapolis architect who went on to design the Woolworth building, which we'll take a look at in a little bit, described it perfectly. He said the skyscraper is a machine for making the land pay. In other words, a way to multiply the value of your land over many, many lettable floors. That's what fuels the skyscraper. That's what pushes it up. What stops it are technological limitations. And until the 1850s, most human construction stayed within the realm of 5 or 6 stories, maybe another story or two. But there is no safe way to mechanically move people up further than that. There were certainly elevators dating back to ancient times. We see hoists with pulleys and ropes, but these were necessarily fraught with danger, and it's not until a particular invention in the 1850s that elevators become widely used for passengers. But even after the invention of the safety brake, which we'll look at here, there were structural limitations, and the inefficiency of brick, even though we think of it as a strong material, requires a lot of cross-sectional area, relatively speaking, to carry loads. And so the structural limitation, the fact that brick piers had to be large, meant that most tall construction was limited, even with elevators, to about 7 or 8 stories. Part of this had to do with a problem that we don't think about anymore, and that is illumination. Until the 1870s, all illumination inside of commercial construction has to either be through candles or through illuminating gas or through daylight. And daylight proves to be both the safest and most cost-effective way to do this. So architects up through the 1890s, and as we'll see even beyond, have to struggle with this fact that the exteriors of buildings in brick want to be both structural, in other words, they want large piers to carry the multiple stories above them, but they also want to be open. They want to have windows that bring in a lot of daylight. John Welborn Root, who with his partner Daniel Burnham designed a number of buildings that we'll look at in this lecture in Chicago, pointed out to a class in 1890 in a lecture that he called the Great Architectural Problem, that the great architectural problem of the skyscraper wasn't necessarily height. That was relatively easy. The great architectural problem was, in fact, how to arrange the building so that every foot within it shall be perfectly lighted. In other words, illumination was as important as structure. If you couldn't bring daylight into a space, you couldn't rent it. Now, we've looked at mill construction, British mill construction, and essentially what we're going to find is that the skyscraper is a kind of variant of British mill construction, but with a couple of changes. One is that the heavy masonry jacket around the outside begins to lighten up, begins to open up so that more and more daylight can come in. The other is a series of changes in the materiality that goes from cast and wrought iron to steel, and that those two things are related. Steel offers structural benefits that replace basically what the masonry jackets around these mill buildings had done. So in one sense, these British mills are proto-skyscrapers, right? 5 to 7 stories of mostly iron construction, but with brick exterior walls that take a lot of the gravity load and also provide all of the building's stiffness. There are a number of buildings throughout the 1860s and even into the 1880s that we might also call proto-skyscrapers, a number of them in New York, which are basically masonry skyscrapers that are assisted by iron. George B. Post, well-known New York architect, does these two buildings, the Equitable Life Insurance in the upper left, which, as you can see, has an atrium that is supported by cast iron columns in the plan, and the one on the bottom and in the image on the right, which is the Produce Exchange. And this building uses iron extensively, as you can see in the construction photo, but again also relies on masonry walls for most of its lateral stability. Not only are those masonry walls carrying the load of the floors at the building exterior, but they're also providing the stiffness against wind. Now, a lot of these changes happen in Chicago, and it's important to talk about why Chicago is different from New York. There are a couple of reasons. One, the geography of the city is such that real estate speculation there gets to be much more intense. The booms and busts in Chicago are much greater, and that has to do with the geography of the city. When the city is founded, there are Native American trading routes that take advantage of the fact that the end of the Chicago River is just a short portage from the Des Plaines River. And when you bridge that divide, you go from the Great Lakes, and thus the St. Lawrence River, and thus the Atlantic, to the Des Plaines, and then the Illinois, and then the Mississippi, and then the Gulf of Mexico. So Chicago, even before it's a city, sits at the intersection of these two great trade routes. As European settlement takes place, they realize the benefits of the city could be even more enormous if there's a direct connection. That portage is eliminated by a canal in 1848. That means now that river boats can bring goods from the entire Mississippi Basin up the Chicago River to the city. Those goods have to then be taken off and put on boats that can handle the rougher weather of the lake. So right away there is an exchange between goods that are brought by river and goods that are shipped by lake. And when the railroad begins to work its way west, you can see that the rails have to go around the southern end of Lake Michigan, which means they have to go through Chicago, now a sort of burgeoning town that is already used to the idea that it's a place where goods get taken off of one set of boats and put onto the other. And as the new nation's rails begin to percolate west, what you find is that all of the agricultural wealth from European settlers farming the land, taking their excess crops to local stores where they can be put on trains and shipped east, gives Chicago a so-called hinterland that is really the size of Western Europe. If you combine France and Spain and most of Germany, you get an area that's about the same as the gray area on the map. And you can see that all of those rails take the grain from this region, bring it around the southern end of Lake Michigan. There are two sets of rails, one that does that and the other that takes the grain from Chicago out east. The two don't connect, and so just like the river boats and the lake boats, grain has to be taken off of one set of trains and put onto another. So Chicago, again, is a place where goods are exchanged. They're taken off of one set of transportation and put onto another. Chicago, therefore, becomes one of the great rail centers of the country, becomes the center of engineering expertise. So iron foundries in Chicago make the wrought iron that is used for railroad bridges throughout the West. Prefabricated bridges can be loaded onto a train, taken out to the end of the line where the rail has met a kind of impassable river. The kit of parts bridge can be assembled by a crew of lightly skilled workers, and the railroad can continue to move west. A lot of that expertise, a lot of that industrial production ends up in Chicago. So there's a native iron industry that grows up there. And as you can see, this is a map from about 1890. What we today call downtown Chicago is literally surrounded by both a harbor and a set of rail yards that are all about taking the grain from these farms and putting it onto boats or putting it onto other rails, and at the same time shipping things to manufacture the rest of the railroad network west. When you look at the river, you see that it is dotted with grain elevators, with lumber yards, and with warehouses. And it's only really the center city, what today we call the loop inside the elevated railroad, that is a commercial center. The rest of the city, the riverfront, all of the lakefront, is taken up with railroads and warehouses and grain elevators. Again, a great deal of construction expertise goes into some of these buildings. Grain elevators are kind of rethought, reinvented in Chicago. The first concrete grain elevators are built in the Chicago region at the end of the century. Here you can see a couple of the largest ones. These are the Illinois Central grain elevators. They stood about where Vista Tower stands now on the riverfront. And on the bottom you can see that the rest of the riverfront is just taken up with warehouses and lumber yards. So this is all material that is either going to be shipped west to make houses throughout the Midwest, or east, grain that's going to the markets of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Now, interestingly, the other major construction that happens in Chicago are offices. All of this exchange means that there is money to be made, that speculators can come in and they can buy what are called futures contracts. They can promise farmers out in Iowa and Minnesota and Nebraska a certain price for grain that's going to come in a few months. If they think that the eastern markets are going to pay more, then the speculator pockets the difference. And this kind of gambling is the basis of today's commodities exchange. And it grows up in Chicago because there is so much material, there's so much grain that is sitting in these elevators waiting for shipment out east. It allows speculators to come in and bet on the material without actually having to own it or to house it themselves. Because this is a very sort of personal set of transactions, you have to bet with other speculators. You need access to bankers, you need access to lawyers, you need access to telegraph machines. A new type of commercial construction grows up in the city, and that is the speculative office building. These are some examples on the right of offices that are built in the loop before the 1871 fire, so in the 1850s and 1860s. And you can see that they are dense. They're trying to cram as many of these rent-paying speculators as they can onto the site of the land. But they're not yet very tall. They're only, again, those 5 to 7 stories. Now, you often hear that, well, the elevator is what allowed buildings to go much taller, and that's partly true. Elisha Otis, an elevator engineer from Connecticut, perfects the safety brake, which, as you can see in the demonstration photo there in the middle, this, by the way, takes place in the Crystal Palace of 1852 in New York City, the kind of plagiarized version of London's Crystal Palace that New Yorkers build. You can see Otis himself there standing on a hoist, and at the top you can see that his assistant has cut the rope that holds the hoist. His safety brake, which relies on a centrifugal gear that measures the speed of the elevator and engages a brake when it feels it going too quickly, has saved him, has prevented him from crashing to his death. And you can see the shocked festival goers in the front who are just sure that they've been about to see someone fall to a horrible end, and they are impressed by Otis's invention. Now, that is part of the story, right? That would allow you to go up higher beyond 5 or 7 stories if the structural technology were there too. The structural technology by then exists. We've looked at cast iron fronts, we've looked at cast iron structure. We've seen that the compressive strength of cast iron should allow you to go as tall as you want. And cast iron has the additional advantage of being much more efficient than brick. Here you can see two sets of surviving cast iron fronts in Chicago. On the right in particular, you see a handful of buildings built in the 1870s out of brick and then retrofit with cast iron storefronts on the first level, probably in the 1880s or 1890s. And you can see right away what the advantages of cast iron, both for structure and for daylighting. The iron columns at the lower level are much, much smaller than the brick piers above, and therefore they offer much more efficiency. They can carry the same loads with less cross-sectional area, and that thus opens up much, much larger areas of glass. Here, those areas are being used to show off the goods in the retail stores at the base, but you can imagine very quickly architects and clients getting interested in the way that cast iron could let more illumination in on the upper floors as well. So, if cast iron solves all the problems, why doesn't Chicago use it? And the answer is that these cast iron buildings are from the 1870s and 1880s because all of the cast iron that was in the loop downtown perished right alongside the light timber construction that burned in the infamous fire of 1871. In the front left, you can see the ruins of a cast iron building. Because cast iron is so brittle and because it is sensitive to thermal expansion, what firefighters found was that even as cast iron lost its strength when it was exposed to the heat of a fire, it was even worse if they tried to put the fire out. That when they turned their hoses onto a cast iron structure, the thermal shock of the iron suddenly being quenched meant that the columns as often as not would just explode and bring the whole building down with it. So cast iron proves particularly vulnerable to fire, both because it loses strength in the heat of a building fire and because it has this sort of awful side effect of shattering when exposed to thermal stress. It's not that Chicago doesn't use cast iron, but it uses it very cautiously, and particularly in the decade after 1871, what Chicago builders do is they go to a new type of brick to be a sort of hybrid with cast iron. So just like George Post's hybrid buildings in New York, we see a generation or so of hybrid buildings in Chicago as well. Chicago is built on the shores of a slow-moving river, so it has plenty of access to clay, and there is a homegrown brick industry that grows up around the city that uses machines imported from Philadelphia to begin with to actually produce a better form of brick. If you remember when we went back a couple of weeks ago, we looked at the difference between sun-dried and kiln-fired brick and noticed that there was about double the strength that you get with fired brick over mud brick by putting it into a kiln and evacuating all the water through heat. Pressed brick uses hydraulic pressure to squeeze the water out of the wet clay before firing. And as you can see, the result of pressing and then firing means that pressed brick is roughly double the strength of fired brick, right, which is double the strength of mud brick. Also, like the difference between fired and mud brick, it's hardier, it's less resistant to weathering. So Chicago imports these machines. Brickyards use the clay from around the Chicago River, and the city develops its own brick industry that is quite successful, as you can imagine, because everyone who builds in Chicago is worried about the effects of the fire on iron and on timber. We see the effects of fired brick come in the very, very early years after the fire. This is a chart showing the height of every major building built in downtown Chicago in these 60 or so years. And after the fire in 1871, you see the building sort of goes on for a little bit and then jumps. And this is an indication that architects and builders are beginning to take advantage of this new technology, right, or this improvement on an old technology. The hybrid that is probably most important for Chicago's history is the Montauk block. This is done by John Wellborn Root, who we just looked at talking about the great architectural problem, and his business partner Daniel Burnham. And this was the first skyscraper in Chicago to go above 10 stories. And if you look at the plan, you can see that it's a hybrid. It's a masonry shell. It has 4 columns of cast iron in it. The cast iron is protected with a terracotta jacket that's supposed to insulate it from any building fire. And on the right, you can see what the problem is, right? That the windows are trying to get larger. The brick piers are trying to get larger to carry the structure above. Pressed brick helps because it means that the piers can be small enough that at least you get windows of some size, but those windows are not terribly large. And if you look at the plan of the Montauk, the plan is deep enough that you have to do 2 things. One is you have to open up any interior offices to exterior offices to borrow daylight. So you can see the kind of second row down on the right-hand side of the plan. There is what's probably an executive office with the window and a clerical or secretarial office on the interior. And the wall between those has to be partly glass so that the clerks in the clerical space can get sunlight borrowed from the office on the outside. The other thing you have to do is you essentially have to hollow out the interior. And if you look at the stairwell, you can see that the stairwell is attached to what was called a light court, a balcony that surrounds a space that goes all the way through the building that's designed to bring light into the interior of the floor plan. This one couldn't have been terribly successful. You can see that it's relatively narrow given the height of the building. But it shows how desperate builders, clients, developers were to bring illumination into their building, that they had to sacrifice area that could otherwise be rented to sort of scoop out building mass and find ways to introduce daylight into it. In the next portion of the lecture, we'll talk about the other major development that the Montauk presented, and this has to do with the same clay that brickmakers are using to build to make the material of the Montauk. Has to do with what happens when you put a heavy brick structure onto that clay and try to support it. The Montauk solution would become one that was uniquely Chicago's, and that would contribute to a very, very particular way of thinking about skyscraper construction in that city.